You can import files from Illustrator and Photoshop into After Effects and treat them the same way as other still images, or you can choose to import them as compositions, retaining all of the individual layers for animation. Let's see how this is done. Go to File, Import, File, and choose Castle.ai. We'll begin by importing as footage. I'll click OK. We can choose to import all of the layers merged together, or just choose a single layer. Our scene is made up of a castle, a moon, and a background, so we can choose to just import one of these. But we'll import them all merged together as a single footage item. If I drag Castle.ai down to the new composition icon to make a new composition, we see that we have a single layer. This means that we can't animate the individual components, the moon, the castle, and the background, separately. But if we don't need to animate the individual components, this is just fine. One thing to keep in mind when importing vector graphics into After Effects is the continuously rasterized switch. First, let's scale this layer up. I'll press S to reveal just the scale property. Then I'll scale the image way up. And here, we can see some pixelization. The whole point of vector graphics imagery is that we have nice, sharp images, no matter how much we scale them. So why are we getting this pixelization, this stair-stepping with our vector graphic? It's because we don't have the continuously rasterized switch checked. I'll check that now. And there, nice crisp imagery. So what's going on here? If I don't have the continuously rasterized switch checked, when After Effects imports the Illustrator file, it looks at the information from the vectors and does one raster pass, meaning that it computes the pixels that correspond to that vector information. It does that just once, stores that information, and that's the one pixel-based or bitmap image that's used for the image throughout. The problem is that if you scale the layer, After Effects is scaling those original pixels. However, if you click the continuously rasterized switch, then on every frame of the composition, After Effects is going back and re-rasterizing. In other words, it's recomputing the pixels or the bitmap image from the vector information. This takes a little bit more computing time because After Effects has to recompute the image on every frame, but it gives you much better imagery. So if you're scaling up vector graphics, make sure that you have the continuously rasterized switch checked for that vector graphics layer. Now let's see how we can animate the individual components of this castle image. I'll double-click on the project panel, select castle, but this time, instead of import as footage, we'll import as composition. I'll click Open, and open the Castle 2 composition. Now we have a castle layer, a moon layer, and a background layer. So if I select moon, I can simply drag the moon around in the composition panel and move it separately, or press P in the timeline panel to expose the position property, and move just the moon. Notice that the layer is very large. The bounding box is the size of the entire composition. When we chose composition, instead of composition retain layer sizes, we were telling After Effects to break the image into separate layers, but have each layer be the size of the footage item. If instead we go to File, Import, File, choose Castle, but this time choose Composition Retain Layer Sizes, and then open the new composition, we see that the bounding box around the moon is just the right size for the moon. Similarly, the bounding box for the castle is just the right size for the castle. And the bounding box for the background is the size of the entire footage item. This is very useful when animating because we have an anchor point that is located in the center of the object as opposed to being in the center of the scene. So if I select moon, press R for rotation, and rotate, the moon is just rotating around its own center. Whereas if I go to the Castle 2 composition, where we have document size layers, and I press R to expose rotation, the moon is rotating around the anchor point of a layer that is document sized, which is not within the moon itself. So the rotation doesn't look right. This is especially important when you're doing character animation. All of these same principles apply when you're importing .psd or Photoshop files as well. Double-click in the project panel, choose beachscene.psd. Notice that you have the same options. I won't bother importing as footage because you probably know how that works now, but we'll skip straight ahead to composition, retain layer sizes. I'll click OK. And here, because there are layer styles in the footage, we can choose whether to leave those editable or merge them into the footage. And we get a chance to reconsider our decision to use composition retain layer sizes. I'll click OK. And open the beach scene composition that's created. It has several layers. For example, this seagull here. You can see that the bounding box for the seagull layer is just the right size for the seagull. And so if I press R to expose the rotation property for the seagull and drag to modify that, the seagull rotates about its center. One thing to keep in mind when importing Illustrator and Photoshop files as compositions with individual layers is that After Effects can only do this if the color mode is RGB. If you have a CMYK file from Illustrator or Photoshop, After Effects can import it, but only as a flattened footage item. The same thing is true of other color modes, such as LAB. So, if you find that you're unable to import a file as a composition, check what its color mode is in Photoshop or Illustrator. And if it's not RGB, switch it to RGB before importing. Also note that After Effects can only decompose Illustrator files into separate layers when those layers are at the top level. To separate objects into individual layers in Illustrator, use the Release to Layers command in Illustrator.